Hi friends, Michael Fay here from Arcadia City Church. I hope you are doing well today. Right now it's Monday and we are filming our sermon on Monday. Yesterday we had an outdoor service and due to some unforeseen technical difficulties, we weren't able to stream our service. But we want to make sure that you are a part of this teaching series over the next 4 weeks. We're going to explore something that Jesus says right here near the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, and we think it's so important, especially in the life of the church, in the life of followers of Jesus. And so we don't want you to miss it. And so we're filming this sermon live here Monday morning here in the church to make sure you don't miss it. And so we hope that you're joining us, you're jumping online, you're watching this sermon, or maybe you're listening to this during your lunch break or wherever you find yourself. We're just thankful for you tuning in and being part of this teaching series. I want to begin this morning by just reading to you the words of Jesus from Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. Jesus says this: "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." These are Jesus' words to us right here at the beginning of this teaching in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. If you've been with us over the last several weeks, you know that over the next several months, we're going to journey through this most famous teaching of Jesus, a teaching called the Sermon on the Mount. And we spent the last several weeks looking at this section right at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, kind of Jesus' intro to his sermon called the Beatitudes, the blessings that he gives at the very, very beginning of the sermon. And now Jesus kind of changes gears. He moves from these blessings into this statement: "You are the salt of the earth, and you are the light of the world." And over the next 4 weeks, we're going to explore, what does this mean for us as followers of Jesus to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world? And we're going to explore how we can actually be those things as followers of Jesus. But today I have the task of wrestling with, what does it mean that you and I are salt of the earth, or you and I as followers of Jesus are light of the world? What does that mean? Why would Jesus use these two metaphors, these two pieces of imagery to describe who he wants us to be? Once again, if you have your Bibles, I would encourage you to kind of follow along. We're going to continue to keep referencing back to this passage in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. But first, I want to look at the first piece of imagery that Jesus uses, and that is salt. Salt. You are the salt of the earth. Why would Jesus use salt to describe his followers? Well, if I was to ask you today in our age, what is the main use of salt, you most likely would say, well, it's used for flavoring, right? If you like to cook, if you like to grill, you know the importance of salt when it comes to seasoning or flavoring the things that you're cooking, right? If you love to grill, one of the secrets to making a great steak is seasoning it with salt. If you like to grill chicken or cook other dishes, salt is often what brings out the flavor of the thing that you're cooking. If you like to bake, salt is so important when it comes to balancing out the sweetness of something that you're making. One of Christy and I's favorite places to go on date night is Chelsea's Kitchen. And pre-COVID, they used to have right by the front door, and some of you know exactly what I'm talking about if you've been there, right by the front door, they used to have this kind of little thing. You lift the lid, and there was this mountain of chocolate chip cookies. But they weren't just any chocolate chip cookies. They were these salted chocolate chip cookies. On top of all the cookies was sprinkled this thick layer of sea salt. And you're probably thinking, that's kind of weird to have chocolate chip cookies that have so much salt on them, but I can't tell you how amazing they are. And if you've had them, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So you might first think that when Jesus is using this statement of you are the salt of the earth, that he's most likely talking about this idea of flavoring. And while I think we could bring out the point or make the point that part of our role as followers of Jesus is to bring out the God flavors, if you will, of the earth, as Eugene Peterson would say, I think that there's truth in that. But that's not necessarily what most commentators believe that Jesus is referencing when he calls us the salt of the earth. Many people believe that what Jesus is referencing and what was the main use of salt in his day and age was this idea of preservation. Right? In Jesus' day and age, they didn't have refrigerators. You couldn't simply take some meat or some food that you had and keep it fresh by putting it in your little fridge right there in your home in this Mediterranean region Jesus grew up in. No, you would store your food or things that could spoil or decay like meat, you would store that in salt. The salt, in a sense, would cure this meat. It would prevent the bacteria that would grow when food begins to decay and rot. It would keep that bacteria away. It would kill it off. Salt was used, its main function was preservation. So in a sense, what we see in this world is that Jesus is saying, you are these agents of preservation in the world, in the earth. Now, what does that imply about the world that we live in? Well, Jesus is implying here that the world around us is a world filled with death and decay. That without the involvement of followers of Jesus, the trajectory of the earth is one that just leads to death and decay. But our role as followers of Jesus are to be these agents of transformation. That our presence might be one in which we bring life. We preserve the truth. We prevent things from descending into death and decay. You are the salt of the earth. That's your role in this world that I've placed you in. Jesus then references us and says that we are the light of the world. Light. You and I both know that light has the power to illuminate things. If you were sitting in a dark room and you were to light a candle, just that small flame would cast light into a room. It's amazing how much that small little flicker of a candle can kind of drive darkness back and allow you to see so many things in a room. Light illuminates. Light gives us a guidance on our path. Many of you know my wife Christy has an eye condition that makes it very difficult for her to see at night. And so if you're ever spending time with us and you're around us when the sun goes down and it's dark outside and you'll see Christy walking, oftentimes you'll see her pull out her phone, turn on her flashlight. We're so thankful that phones have flashlights. And she'll kind of walk with her camera out, guiding her path, right? Light illuminates our path. It guides us. Light also brings hope, right? When we think about darkness, oftentimes darkness can be used as this idea of despair. And a light dawning on the horizon brings hope. This is the metaphor the prophet Isaiah uses with the arrival of Jesus, right? A light breaking on the horizon. There's hope for us that we will not remain in the darkness. This is who Jesus tells us that we are. We are the light of the world, which implies something about what Jesus thinks about this world. It implies that Jesus would say that this world is full of darkness. Now, it doesn't take watching the news for very long or kind of scrolling on social media to see that there is lots of darkness in our world. And so what Jesus stresses here in this moment is that you and I are lights in this darkness, that we are called to shine the light of Jesus, to perhaps bring hope into the lives of other people, to perhaps bring guidance for people out of despair and sadness and brokenness. That you and I are called to be these agents of change wherever we find ourselves. Now look what Jesus kind of adds on to each one of these statements. You are the salt of the earth and you are the light of the world. Look what he adds on kind of right after each one of those statements. About salt, he says, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? Right? If the salt loses the thing that makes it salty, well, how does it give that back? He says it doesn't and just gets thrown out and trampled underfoot. It's just kind of like thrown out by the path that we just walk on. It's just like it's pointless. He says, neither do people light a lamp, in referring to light. We don't light a lamp and put it under a bowl, right? The purpose of light is to put on a lampstand and light up the whole house, if you will. If you light a lamp and you put it under a bowl and it can't do what it's meant to do, then what's the point of it? If the salt isn't salty and can't do what salt can do, and if the light is hidden under a bowl and can't do what light is supposed to do, then what's the point of having them? Right? These two things, these agents of change that are designed to impact the things they come in contact with, if they lose that power, if they lose that potency, then what's the point? What Jesus is saying here is, in the same way, if you and I, as followers of Jesus, lose our potency, we lose our willingness to be these transforming agents affecting those around us, then what's the point? I just want to pause here for 1 second. And I want to just say, maybe if you're watching this, someone sent you this link, or you've stumbled upon this and you're not a follower of Jesus, you still don't really know where you stand on faith, and you're just kind of listening because it seems somewhat interesting, or for some reason you find yourself watching this sermon and you're not a follower of Jesus, I would tell you that living with this mindset of being salt and light is the best way to live. I believe that. But if you're not a follower of Jesus, then there's no obligation for you to live this way. I think it's the best way to live, but there's no obligation to you on you to live this way if you're not a follower of Jesus. But if you are a follower of Jesus, if you've committed to follow Jesus with everything that you are, I want to just let you know, this is not a kindly suggestion from Jesus. Jesus doesn't say, hey, try to be the salt of the earth, or do your best to be the light of the world. These aren't suggestions, these aren't kindly requests of Jesus, like for us to just try really hard to be this. Jesus says, this is who you are. It's a matter of identity. Jesus is saying, if you are a follower of mine, then this is who you are. I want you to live into this identity. And the truth is, if we're not living into this identity, then Jesus, in a sense, is saying, then what's the point? This is who I've made you to be. I've given you, as my followers, this responsibility to be these transforming agents, salt and light. These people who would preserve the life around them, these people who would shine hope and guidance to the people that they find themselves in contact with. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. This is who you're made to be. Now, just with our short little time left, and our sermon is not going to be long today, I just want to give you just a couple ways to think about how you can begin to be salt and light wherever you find yourself this week and moving on from here today. I think if we want to have an idea of what it looks like to be salt and light, we can just begin with what Jesus told us to do as his followers. Jesus is traveling the countryside with his disciples, and he encounters a man who asks him what the greatest commandment in all of the law actually is. And Jesus responds by quoting Deuteronomy. He says this, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength. And then he says the second command is like the first. In a sense, what he says is, and the second is like this. It's basically saying that first commandment of following God with everything you are, it looks tangibly like this commandment. And he says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Love God and love your neighbor. Now, I think oftentimes what we do as followers of Jesus, and when we look at that statement, when we read that in Scripture that we're called to love our neighbor, we kind of say, well, what Jesus is calling us to do is to love all people. And I think that's true. I think we're called to love all people. But I think when we make that statement so broad, to say that we're called to love all people, love becomes kind of vague. Well, what does it really mean to love all people? And what I want us to ask today, I want us to ask and wrestle with this question, is what if Jesus, in calling us to love our neighbor, was actually calling us to love our literal neighbors? The people who live right next door to you. Maybe they live right next door to you in your apartment complex. Maybe they live right next door to you in your dormitory, or maybe they live right next door to you in your neighborhood. The neighbor who has 7 cats and annoys you, who lives right behind you. Maybe that one neighbor who has a tree that's too shaggy and it drops all these leaves in your yard. Or maybe that neighbor who has get-togethers at his house way too late in the evening and it keeps you up at night. All those neighbors that are hard to love. What if Jesus was actually calling us to love those neighbors, the actual neighbors, the people we live right next door to? Perhaps Jesus is calling us to be salt and light to these people. I stumbled upon this story in a great book called The Art of Neighboring. We've referenced that before a few years ago in a sermon series that we did about loving our neighbors. And the pastors that wrote that book tell this story about being a part of a group of pastors that met with the mayor of Denver, Colorado. And they were meeting with the mayor to talk about some legislation and some new initiatives in order to reach people in their city, to address some of the broken areas of Denver. And so they went through all of these things, and kind of at the end of the meeting, the mayor kind of makes this throwaway line that the pastor said. When the mayor said this, it kind of opened our eyes, and we kind of realized that we had been missing the point. The mayor said, all these initiatives are great, but I think there's one thing that could really transform our city. And the pastors were kind of like, well, what would that be? And the mayor said, well, I think that if people learn to be better neighbors to one another, that might in turn transform our whole city. Because if people learn to be good neighbors to one another, then maybe that street that they're on might be transformed. And if you have multiple streets where there's neighbors that learn how to love their neighbors really well, you might have multiple streets that are transformed, which means you might have a whole neighborhood that's transformed. And if multiple neighborhoods are doing this, you might have whole communities transformed. And if you have whole communities loving their neighbors really well, then our city might be transformed as well. And it was in this moment that these pastors realized we have not done a good job following the greatest commandment of Jesus, and we haven't done a good job teaching our churches to do this very thing, to love our literal neighbors, the people who live directly next to us, that we spend probably more time around than any other people in our lives. What would it look like for you to love your literal neighbors? We're going to give you 4 rhythms over the next 4 weeks that we kind of work through this idea of being salt and light in our communities. And the 4 rhythms that we're going to be sharing with you, we've stolen them from this book called The Neighboring Church. It's a phenomenal book. And I think these 4 rhythms are so practical and helpful in helping us understand how we can be salt and light, how we can love our literal neighbors. And we're going to talk about the first one, but I'm going to introduce all 4 of them to you right now. So here are the 4 rhythms. The first rhythm is stay. The second rhythm is pray. The third rhythm is play. And the fourth rhythm is say. So we have stay, pray, play, and say. They all rhyme. Eventually, by the end of the series, you'll have them all memorized. It'll be wonderful. So once again, stay, pray, play, and say. And today, I want to talk about what is the rhythm stay? What does it mean to stay? Well, they use the word stay in this book to just talk about this idea of being firmly planted in your community, that you in your neighborhood are living where you are living. What would it look like to be planted here and to think about affecting the lives of people that are also planted around you, that they are staying around you? How can you be present to all of these people that you live nearby to? And one of the most practical steps, one of the most practical ways that you can begin to love your neighbor, the first step, and it seems kind of ridiculous, the first step is actually learning the names of your neighbors. Learning the names of your neighbors. I want to ask you right now, and I'll give you just a second to kind of think about that. How many of your neighbors do you know their names? How many names of your neighbors do you know? Go ahead and think. Tally them up right now while we're talking. How many neighbors' names do you know? I guess I'm not ashamed because I'm going to say it to you, but I am a little ashamed about in our former neighborhood. Christy and I are in the process of moving into Arcadia, but in our former neighborhood, We had lived in this house for about 4.5 years, and I'm really introverted. I'm not extroverted, wanting to meet all my neighbors, and so I was the guy who was happy to pull into his driveway or pull into his garage and get out of the car and close the garage and not really talk to anybody. That's just my personality, which is not okay when it comes to neighboring well. But we had lived in this house for about 4.5 years, and I only knew maybe one or two of my neighbors' names. That's not good, right? It's hard to love people if you don't know their names, right? As one pastor I heard say, there's a big difference between saying, "Hey, yo," and "Hey, Joe." There's a big difference between those two things. When you know someone's name, there's intimacy, there's relationship, there's this dependence on one another, there's this familiarity. You have a relationship, you are friends. It's hard to love people if you don't know their names. So Christy and I, we began this process when we kind of worked through this idea of being better neighbors a couple years ago. And what we did is we decided to go door to door and introduce ourselves. Now you might be thinking, well, Michael, I've lived in my house, for 5, 7, 10, 15 years, and we haven't neighbored well, and I don't really know the names of my neighbors, but we've been neighbors for a long time. Isn't it going to be awkward to go and introduce ourselves when we've actually been, we're not new to the neighborhood, when we've actually lived next to each other for a long time? Yes, it might be a little awkward, but all you have to do is say this line. Hey, my name is Michael, and I know we've been neighbors for quite some time, and I just was thinking about it, and man, I've been a bad neighbor. I'd like to get to know you. I'm Michael. What's your name? I'd love to get to know you a little bit better and to be a better neighbor to you. No one is going to say, "I'm sorry, you haven't been a good neighbor for the last 10 years, so we can't be friends." That's not going to happen. And if it does, email me that so I can use that as a sermon illustration. It's not going to happen, right? The first step is just going over and introducing yourself to your neighbor, right? The best way to first love our neighbors is get to know their names. Last time we talked about this idea of neighboring, we have these magnets with a picture of your house and then the 8 houses that kind of border your house, the people who live behind you, the people who kind of live behind you kind of diagonally, the people who live right next door to you, and the people who live across the street from you, right? What would it look like to get to know all of those people? Now, one of the things I know about Arcadia, if you're watching this in the neighborhood of Arcadia, what I know about Arcadia is Arcadia is a very neighborly community. People do know their neighbors really, really well. So maybe you right now, you're patting yourself on the back because you're thinking, I know all names of the 8 houses that kind of border my house, and I know all of them. And so I'm doing what Michael and Christy are asking. I'm doing what my church is calling me to do. I think that's phenomenal, but I would challenge you to take it one step further. What the Neighboring Church book and resource would encourage you to do is, how can you not only learn their names, but perhaps learn their histories, their hopes, and their hurts? In a sense, how can you dive a little bit deeper in relationship? How can you perhaps begin to consider some of these things about what's going on in their lives below the surface? What's their story? What are the things that they're wrestling with right now, their hurts? What are the hard things they're walking through? What are the things they're hoping for, that as they look to the future, they're working towards those things? How can you kind of take that relationship, that friendship with your neighbors to the next level? Several years ago, Christy and I, in our neighborhood, had a family who lived just about 4 houses down from us. We knew this family because I had taught both the kids when I was a teacher. And I had taught them there, and then after I taught them, they kind of were a few years older. They actually moved in the neighborhood. We saw them a couple times, and we just said hello. But we didn't really seek to be good neighbors to these people, to people in our community at this time. And it's one of our greatest regrets that we didn't do this, because I was coming home from work several years ago, and as I was driving into my driveway, I noticed an ambulance parked in front of the house. There was a fire truck, there was police cars. I was kind of surprised and was wondering what was going on, so I parked my car. I go inside, I say, Christy, something's going on down the street. I'm going to go find out what's happened. And as I begin to walk down the street, I realized that they're parked in front of this family's house who we knew on a very surface level, but weren't once again invested in their lives. As we got close, I could realize something was not right. I saw both of the kids, the students that I had taught before, being held in the arms of family members. And what we came to find out was that our neighbor, this woman that we knew at a very surface level, was battling severe depression and walking through extremely difficult things, so difficult, in fact, that it prompted her to take her own life. And I say this with such heartbreak because this is one of our greatest failures, Christian and I's greatest failures in terms of being neighbors to those who live around us. How could things perhaps have been different if we had made the effort to invest in the lives of people who lived directly around us? I don't know, and I'll never know. And it's one of those things to me that it reminds me and it challenged me to ask this question. And I want to close today by asking this question to you. What would it look like for you to consider that perhaps God has placed you exactly where you are in your neighborhood, in your apartment complex, in your dormitory? What would it look like for you to consider that God has placed you exactly where you're placed because he wants you to be salt and light to the people who live directly around you? What if God has placed you exactly where you are because he wants you to have this transforming effect on these people who live next door to you? That he's placed you exactly there for this one purpose, to affect this person's life, to be a bright, shining light of God's grace and hope and love in this person's life. To preserve, to be this preservative in a world of death and decay in the life of the person who lives right behind you, or the person who lives right in front of you, or the person who lives next door to you who has those parties late on Saturday night that keep you up. What if God has placed you exactly where he's placed you for the specific purpose of being salt and light in their lives? I want you to consider that this week. How would that change the way that you interact with your neighbors? How would that change the way when you drive home and you're pulling in your driveway and you see your neighbor out front? Does it change the way perhaps you think about them? Does it change the way that you might approach them? Does it change the way that you see them as individuals in such need of the light, the hope, the love, the grace of Jesus that you and I are called to embody wherever we go? You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. I'm going to close today, and once again, over the next several weeks, we're going to explore what does it look like to be salt and light, and how we can specifically be these things in our neighborhoods. Because I believe that if we just are able to do this within our own families and within the houses right around us, we might begin to see the transformation of our city that we so long to see. Will you pray with me? God, thank you so much for today. Thank you for your words, your challenge. God, for establishing this identity in us as your followers, that we are salt of the earth, that we are light of the world. God, that you have given us this responsibility to be these transforming agents in the lives of people around us. And God, as you said, if we lose that, if we lose sight of that, then what's the point? This is who you made us to be, and so God, we need to live into this identity. God, I pray that this week that we might take the time to consider, maybe as we sit around a table with our family or our spouse or us and our roommates or the people that we share life with, God, that I pray that we would just kind of pause to consider, what would it look like for us to have this mindset that maybe we're here in this neighborhood to be salt and light to the people who live right next door to us? How might that change the way that we interact with our neighbors? How might that change the way that we interact with the people that we see every single day, the people who live in such close proximity with us? What would it look like for us to be salt and light to those people? God, give us the courage to learn our neighbors' names. Give us the discernment and the wisdom to consider being salt and light in the world you have called us to live in. Jesus, we love you. We pray these things in your holy and precious name. Amen. Go in his grace and in his peace. We'll see you next Sunday right here at Arcadia City Church. Have a great day.